here at this event that is co-hosted by the Department of Sociology at CEU and the Radical Student Collective. The Radical Student Collective is a group of self-organized students who are interested in leftist thought, so if you are into that sort of thing, don't hesitate to get involved. When I was thinking of how to introduce our speaker, I was reminded of a conversation I had in one of these lefty pubs in Budapest when it occurred to one of my pessimistic friends if the Hungarian left still exists, and my answer to that, I mean, at least we still have Gáspár, Miklós, Tamás. So please welcome Gáspár Miklós Tamás, who's a distinguished philosopher. He's would describe himself as a public intellectual hated by his own country. Please welcome Tamás. Just a second. So it's also our speaker's 70th birthday. So we decided to get him some wine, and also, if I'm not wrong with this, a chocolate Karl Marx statue for his little daughter.
Okay, thank you. We'll drink it. Thank you. I'm overwhelmed. Thank you. Sweet of you. I'm very sorry to reciprocate with another sad story I am to tell you. But that's not its main characteristic. When talking about Central Europe, a century of Central European history from 1918 to 2018, I will choose the three main cases of the democratic and socialist revolutions in 1918, the German case, the Austrian case, and the Hungarian case. I shall describe them very succinctly, or I hope so, and then I will then pass to the theoretical and historical, in a more serious sense, problems that arise from these cases. And also, I think it's quite instructive to consider the differences between these three cases, because they are, as it were, the path that European history has followed. Okay, let's first go to Germany. Also, I want to warn you that very characteristically, the democratic revolutions have broken out only in the countries that have lost the First World War. And here, of course, I do include Russia. That, of course, was officially the ally of the victorious Entente, but it was more or less destroyed by that's my phone, sorry. Sorry. Okay, sorry. So, and so was Italy. Basically, these two countries that have been formerly the allies of the victorious powers have been destroyed in the war, and there had been also, of course, as you know very well, very important revolutionary events. But I shall restrict myself to these three cases of Central Europe. In Germany, the moment of defeat of the German Empire in the war on the Western Front has been only a part of the general crisis of Germany. It was the military defeat, and also it was the defeat of the forces that were ranged against the war. It was the defeat of social democracy, as you know, and social democracy that supported the war, that would have been, in principle, an element of reconstruction and of radical change towards democracy and such stuff, has been deeply compromised and has been permeated by nationalism, like any other German historical important political current. So therefore, the forces that could have saved Germany from its bad part, as it were deeply compromised and split and in a deep moral and political crisis to begin with. And hence, of course, the split within social democracy. First, of course, the independent Social Democrats broke away, and, of course, then the Spartakusbund, the kernel of the future Communist Party. And, as you know, a republic was declared, and Germany sued for peace. The monarchy broke down, the emperor fled, all that, very spectacular. But all those forces that have taken the power have been the same power that assisted the war effort and were allies of the German Reich. Foremost among them, social democracy. Social democracy at this moment was, of course, willing, as it was always willing, to make the country more democratic. But, of course, it has become a bourgeois party, and its main aims, that was a long development in the last third of the 19th century already, it had become a democratic party more than a socialist party. So it was very sincerely and very determinedly an anti-feudal, anti-militaristic, anti-monarchical, and anti-ecclesiastical, anti-church party. So the plan that has been presented to the German proletariat was, of course, the plan of a bourgeois republic modeled mostly on France, of course. And this, of course, would have meant also an end to federalism, an end to regionalism in Germany, and but this would have been realized only if the army would have been suspended or destroyed politically, and the political power of the army would have ceased, and of the old bureaucracy, old imperial bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. This hasn't happened. The new power that came into being was an uneasy alliance from all forces that wanted to finish the revolution before it really has started. And here there was a proper alliance from old social democracy and between the army and some moderate forces, including some liberals, some conservatives. I won't tell you the whole story in detail, of course, I cannot. And so therefore, from the first moment, the main fight, the main conflict has been between the forces of socialist renewal, of a communist revolution, and those who didn't want to go forward with that. The schism that has lasted, for 60, 70 years afterwards, has determined, in the long run, Germany's history. And as you know very well, in Germany, this story has ended in a first act with the murder of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, with the complicity of social democracy by white guard forces within the army and the paramilitary extreme right milieu, and other regional revolutions like in Bavaria and so on were also vanquished. So the conflict in Germany has been a very, very acute and harsh conflict between forces of socialism and the rest. And this rest was also divided between those who wanted to go forward with the peace treaty and try to stabilize Germany, and those who would never accept the Versailles Treaty. So it wasn't only Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht who were killed, but so was Erzberger and Rathenau, liberal politicians who, although nationalist, tended to make a peace with Western Europe, with France, especially France and England. And so, therefore, the second divide has produced the militant extreme right in Germany. But not only that. The future forces of fascism have appeared from the first moment. And this is what conventional history usually overlooks. The forces of the extreme right, mostly veterans, former officers, military personnel, and various heirs to the traditional German extreme right that existed before too, have made an uneasy coalition that have already set the goal of saving old Germany by removing the political power of the traditional elites. The removal of traditional elites have been always a sign of the extreme right. It is not new. It is not new. We see it today too. Of course, I know what I'm saying, but this is by no means new. It has been always the case. After all, the extreme right, to speak schematically, the extreme right's goal has always been to save capitalism and removing the bourgeoisie as some group that detains socio-political power, and of course also to remove the conservative forces in the army, in the bureaucracy, in public administration, in parliament, in the press, in universities, whatever. All those elements of the old order have been indeed later removed by the fascist movements and fascist regimes. So it is not true that fascists were not revolutionary. In their own way, they have been, in the mechanical sense, of course, of radical change. If radical change means revolution, then of course they were also revolutionary. But certainly, if you consider revolution as a change to the better, well, that of course wasn't the case. But most certainly, various forces for radical change were also set against each other. It was basically behind the whole chaotic history of 20s and 30s Germany, which I won't describe, of course, I don't have time for that. Behind that, there was a conflict between two radical camps. It was clear that the old order won't persist. It is either the communists or the fascists. And this was to a certain extent clear to those people too, who hated this outcome. And this was why, for example, such a former conservative as Thomas Mann has said already in the late 1920s, he was extremely conservative and nationalist before, that if we want to keep civilization, which always means the old order, then vote Social Democrat. Vote Social Democrat. That was in a speech. It was his first ever political statement of that nature. And others too. And so it was a very complicated and long story. The communists also tried various coups d'etat. In 1923, they tried, with the conniving of the Comintern, tried to make a putsch in Germany that in October that failed lamentably. And that, of course, has also divided the Communist Party along putschist, radical, and less radical wings. It's a long story, which I would love to tell you, but I can't. And but the question was put in Germany in very radical terms that also determines the intellectual history of this age in Germany during what is called the Weimar Republic, which is a very ironical description because the Weimar Republic itself, its liberal and democratic ideas were in a minority in Germany even while it existed. And so, no other country had leading thinkers, leading to our eyes, of course, the eyes of posterity, but, Karl Schmitt and Walter Benjamin. You don't have such fundamental radicalism of the left and of the right on a very high intellectual level in any other country. And, of course, it's logical because the conflict was profound and also fatal for the history of humankind. In Austria, you have a completely different story because there, social democracy was more left-wing and more revolutionary than German social democracy, although they too went along with the war, but they tried to distance themselves earlier. And here you see historical episodes also always play a role. And this historical episode that was determining the outcome was, of course, the act of Friedrich Adler, who went to that famous hotel in Vienna, had lunch, finished his lunch, had lunch, and the Prime Minister, Count Sturck, had his lunch there too, and then Friedrich Adler raised from the table, paid his bill, and shot the Prime Minister. And his speech before the court, 6 hours, longer than my lecture tonight. But the judges then were still liberal judges, unlike time limitations in academic milieu. And so he could speak. He was condemned first to death and then to life. And he explained in that speech, that is of absolutely decisive importance in Austrian history, explained why he had to do this, a pacifist, an enemy of any killing, a deeply moral man and a Kantian. He was a Kantian thinker, pupil of Mach. And he said that morality demands that somebody sacrifices himself or herself for the moral goal, even if he acts against morality itself. That's exactly the thought of Georg Lukács in 1919. So it's not unique. It's a thought present in all revolutions, but of course because these were great revolutions, so they wouldn't lie, they were not hypocritical. They presented the dilemmas in an open and tragic way, because of course it is a tragic dilemma. And it wasn't papered over by any superficial optimism. And so, a new social democratic party that Fritz Adler survived and was member of the new leadership of the Social Democratic Party. Later, he was secretary of the Socialist International. Imagine today to have a tyrannicide as a member of the leadership of the Socialist International today sitting in the European Parliament. Ha ha. And, okay, so that was quite different, you see. And the Social Democratic Party of Austria was first accepted the revolutionary basic idea of a change, and second, renounced at all national reparations. Unlike Germany and Hungary, that after the really unjust and unfair peace treaties and so on of Versailles and Trianon, the peace treaty of Saint-Germain was not resisted by Austria. Austria did not want its territories back, and it was, maybe quite glad to be rid of us and of the Slavic countries and so on. And most certainly, the Austrian left wanted to join Germany. There was the old democratic idea from 1848, when in Frankfurt, in St. Paul's Cathedral in Frankfurt, the revolutionists declared the new democratic German Republic. That was the idea of the whole German and Austrian left. The word Anschluss comes from an article of Karl Renner, the future Social Democratic Chancellor of Austria. And first, the country was rebaptized by the Social Democratic government, Deutsch Österreich, German Austria, to be clear. So that is Austria not in the Habsburg sense as being, the central place of the empire, of a multinational empire. We are Germans. Goodbye, you Slavs and Hungarians. And so the thing was that for this reason, the tragic energies between extreme nationalists in Germany and in Hungary and the internationalist communists was not so acute. Also, this explains why alone among Central European countries, Austria never had a great communist party. It was always a little minority organization. Still is. Even smaller, of course, than it used to be, but it was always small. And so Austria has received a respite from 1918 to 1934, and during this time social democracy too could prove that what it can do, and they did lots of things, having been the first modern welfare state that we know of. Quite successful and so on and so forth. But of course, that too was vanquished by the fascists. Ultimately, the fate of Austria was similar to most European countries. This is, of course, the real subject of my lecture today. And then Hungary, that was a third case where there was neither a split of the Social Democratic Party, because the new Communist Party was mostly from other people, led by other people than former Social Democrats at first. And but it ended in March 1919 with a merger of the Social Democratic and Communist parties, a unique event in that at that time, where there was a famous party being split into Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, wasn't it? And so on. And in Hungary, social democracy could not find any arguments against a radical socialist turn. Why not? Why not? Why did not Hungarian social democrats, like their German and partially their Austrian counterparts, stick with democracy and reforms and so on and so forth? For various reasons. Of course, bad conscience about the war and such things, of course, had their importance. But mostly because when there were the first conflicts between social democrats and communists, the first Republican government was, of course, a coalition of liberals, radicals, social democrats, and so on and so forth in October 1918. And they wanted to base their power on some real social forces. And then they found that there was no Hungarian bourgeoisie. That there was Hungarian capitalism, mostly owned by foreign companies, but the domestic bourgeoisie was either small and weak or very interestingly, permeated by radical ideas itself. There were no defenders of the moderate republic. Zsigmond Kunfi, one of the great leaders of Hungarian social democracy, and later of the Austrian social democracy in exile, has said that that's not true, that there were two revolutions in Hungary in 1918, the Bourgeois Democratic Revolution, and in 1919, the Communist one. There's just two chapters of a socialist revolution. The only force during the Democratic Republic in Hungary was the working class. The army, Hungary didn't have its own army, being a part of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, and she had to fight against the attackers from Romania, from Czechoslovakia, the French army, etc., etc. Where to find an army? Then we had divisions of shoemakers, printers division, metal workers division. It was the trade unions that were the only potent agents of power and of change. There's nobody else. That was one thing. The second thing, as important as this one, was, of course, that Hungary was, of course, a rather backward agrarian country in most of its parts. It was a very mixed bag of various social arrangements, but it was on the whole still an East European country in part, with great estates in the provinces. The power of the church has been also very important. There's no real personal independence among agricultural laborers. There was some personal servitude and personal subjugation, and against which there was a passion that equals and parallels the French Revolution, not the 20th century revolutions, but the French Revolution. A real passion against privilege, against birth privilege, against caste system, and a real passion for equality that has been synthesized with the socialist ideals that have conquered the urban proletariat. It was a very strong revolution. Don't believe anybody who tells you differently. And there were no counter forces for a while. Archbishops and such people, even Budapest University has been the most reactionary force in old Hungary, being a Catholic institution, mostly swore, various oaths of loyalty to the new republic. Archbishop Joseph has changed his name into Felcsúti, and it's not my fault, and considered himself to be an humble citizen of the new Hungarian Republic, renouncing his titles and his estates and his sword. He was a marshal in the Austro-Hungarian army and so on and so forth. Then he changed his mind, and this was conveniently forgotten. And but that was the moment. So at the first moment, it seemed to be the most victorious and easily victorious revolution of all. There was no resistance. And of course, you know what happened. Both the Social Democratic and then the common government of communists and social democrats in Hungary, in the Soviet Republic, the Council Republic of Hungary, its complete names, I'll tell you because that's a very characteristic for the age. Then the name of Hungary was the Socialist and Federated Council Republic of Hungary. That was its official name. And so the idea was, of course, regarding the ethnic minorities, to have a federal state in which all ethnic minorities will enjoy their rights, their autonomy, and so on and so forth. But, of course, the successor states didn't want any of that. And so the whole time of the revolution was spent with what they were actually rebelling against, with war. So war against the Entente, which, of course, was, 100 times stronger than, of course, little and poor Hungary, at the time, of course, destroyed by 4 years of warfare, and it was attacked by our neighbors, and also by the collusion of the ethnic minorities on Hungarian territory. That's the Hungarians among you are familiar probably with the famous talks in Arad, where the greatest defender of the Hungarian ethnic minorities, Oskar Jászai, who was at the time minister in the Republican government, Minister for Nationalities, encountered his old friends whom he protected and helped in the first decades of the 20th century, being now ministers in the new Romania, and telling him, sorry, no autonomy, no federation, we're taking Transylvania away, goodbye. And, okay, so therefore, and the government, the socialist and communist government, did not accept this. Actually, the first government has fallen because of the conditions that Franchet d'Espéré presented to the Hungarian government. The new frontiers then had actually indeed become the new frontiers of contemporary Hungary, and the first government said that they are not prepared to sign this, and this was the moment in which the communist government came to power, promising socialism and promising fighting the enemy and keeping Hungary's territorial integrity. It was a war of defense that allegedly only right-wing armies and regimes can fight. As it happens, this is not true. And but of course they were defeated, and we know what happened afterwards. In 1919 to 1920-21, we had the first real taste of fascist-style rule in any country. Then later it was moderated and stabilized, and they ceased terror, but it was the first inkling anybody could have of what future may bring. They were also very, very popular among the extreme left, extreme right in the neighboring countries, and it was a common cause. The future Hungarian Prime Minister, Gyula Gömbös, has hidden the killers, again echoes, the killers of Chancellor Erzberger on his estate. Also, he has been instrumental in hiding the assassins of Marseille, where King Alexander of Yugoslavia has been murdered, and Barthou, the French foreign minister. These were organized by elements, right-wing elements in the Hungarian military, co-organized, as it were. Okay, so it was quite plain. There is an international of the nationalists and of the extreme right-wing. So, okay, so these were the three types, very sketchily described, of Central European revolutions. Now, it is very interesting that although the three cases have been different, the outcome, although not identical, has been quite similar. After all, the things that happened in Germany and in Austria, 33, 34, not a great distance in time, have been almost identical, although in Austria there's been a second fascist putsch in 38, but that doesn't interest us. How is it possible that such different fates of the socialist revolution in the years after the First World War ended in a total takeover, slow or fast, and total takeover of fascism on the European continent? In 1940, there have been hardly any non-fascist countries on the continent of Europe. And it's just 20 years from the revolutions. And Europe has been, of course, liberated from outside forces, from the Soviet Union. United States and Great Britain. They are not continental European forces. Europe has not liberated itself. There were no anti-fascist revolutions anywhere. Spain is that's a separate case, but there, of course, the uprising was the fascists against the Socialist Republic. So there was no, indeed, against the fascist state, we don't know. There is no such revolution in history. And Anstoß vom Außen, as it was called, by social democratic theorists in exile in the 30s, was needed. Push from outside, an impact from outside, that will start revolutions. But of course, there was no German revolution when the bombs started to fall on Dresden. No. And the resistance, both in France and Italy and in Yugoslavia and in Greece, well, those were indeed revolutionary events, but they were, of course, national liberation struggles against the foreign occupier, so it's a classic type of rebellion. But against fascism as such, especially against domestic fascism as such, it was against the foreign occupier. It was against Germany, not just your own state, because that has never happened. How is that possible? How is that possible? After all, the most active and the most powerful forces a few years before have been the socialists of various kinds, of various stripes, and whatever has been considered traditionally to be the adversary of the Russian proletariat, the bourgeoisie, did not, in fact, present a great challenge to the socialist revolution, and it did not offer a great resistance to it. In some places, yes, in some places more, in some places less. In Germany, the most, of course, especially the industrial capital was very much opposed, always embroiled with the army and so on and so forth. But who was the enemy? Who has defeated the socialist revolutions of Central Europe? It was not the bourgeoisie. And fascism is just a word. It's just a word. Of course, it means several things. But what was in fascism the part that has been so seductive and so forceful as to take over the majority of public opinion and to do a dual battle against the forces of the old regime and the forces of the socialist revolution, social democrats, communists, left communists and others, and also against some forces of the establishment, like the aristocracy and the church. The aristocracy still had some influence at that time, and landed aristocracy, and the church, especially the Catholic Church, were not in favor. They were not very determined enemies of fascism, but most certainly were not in favor, especially not the atheistic form that National Socialism has embraced, and at the beginning Mussolini's fascism too. Okay, but what was it? The thing is, you see, that the finger of suspicion points at the revolutionary energies contained within fascism. These energies that were directed mostly against bourgeois society as such, more than against capitalism as an abstract system. And that bourgeois society has been described, but also felt by fascists, to be, and rightly so, to be a decadent society, to be at the end of its tether, the end of its history, and decadent in all respects, morally, culturally, socially, unable either to fulfill its promises formulated by the Enlightenment or to renew the system on other bases. And the open romanticism of fascist ideology, invoking a mythical past, that's true, but as regards something outside the myth, that was not backward-looking at all. It was the discovery of biopolitics, and not only race, certainly the most important, of course, it's race, but also they have colonized the various progressive movements, the first inceptions of the environmentalist movements, the dream of living naturally, all those refugees to the nature, all those vegetarians, all those people in the gymnastic associations, etc., joined the Nazi Party almost in their entirety. The old antipathy, characteristic of all European civilization, of over-urbanization, of artificiality, of the cultural consequences of capitalism with the various contrived and artificial forms, because, of course, the basic form of a capitalist society is, of course, the contract. It is a society that is based on legal regulations that are both abstract and repressive. And the abstract side of it, meaning that politics trumps law, human action, human aspirations, human passion, human belonging, human identity, human sensuality, is trump the abstractness of capital and the abstractness of law. Very well felt. That's the old complaints against capitalism since the 17th century, nothing new in that. But combining them not with the old romanticism's conservative attitude, but the revolutionary attitude, that was new. And it was an explosive mixture. And there were also other elements. The refusal of intellectualism, against echoes of today, but, again, nothing is very new. There are precedents for everything. But that precedent character is not so important. Saying that sentiment trumps intellect. Passion trumps reason. Reason is a trick that is used against you, German people, by such dominant groups that could not rule naturally, because they have neither inherited nor earned that power. Intellectuals, bourgeois, and others who don't visibly do something with their bodies and with nature in order to improve their station. And also the recognition of the role of violence and renouncing universalism, saying that we are right to kill, but the others are criminals if they kill, because we are we and they are they. We don't have to explain. And that is always a very, very effective revolutionary attitude if people refuse to explain and refer to what appears as self-evident. Appears in all revolutions. Of course, I was quoting purposely, of course, the words from the Declaration of Independence, but still, that element of pointing to the undisputable, and to right the unrightable wrong, is indeed extremely important revolutionary element, and the left was similar to the bourgeoisie in its rationalism, and its intellectualism, and its universalism. Fascism seemed to be a more radical renewal in seemingly breaking with the whole heritage of the Enlightenment, with science, with good governance, and other nonsense of that kind. And Enlightenment, after all, trusts reason, science, etc., in order to improve people's station. combined with liberalism, where human agency is trusted on itself in principle, where human individuality is cherished and worshipped, those appear as insufficient grounds to keep any community together. And the forces that are in a capitalist society and bourgeois society ruling are invisible or in a minority, but anyway, they cannot claim for themselves any natural link to the community. They are not its majority, and they are not its hard-working members, and they are separate from it by the interests and by the culture and about their separate view of the good human life based on a rational kind of livelihood, on a philosophy, in other words. Anti-philosophical attitude, of course, has always been an element of conservatism, and it has been inherited by fascism, and to this very day, an opposition to science and to philosophy is a distinguishing mark of the far right. It has always been, and it still is. And so on and so forth. So therefore, what were the slogans of fascists? The will. The will, that's one thing. And youth, giovinezza. And the right of young nations, das Recht der jungen Völker. That was, of course, a famous book that has been a great inspiration for the Nationalist Socialist Party, National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. And you see, and also, of course, they've taken over many things, of course, from the communists and from the socialist movement, obviously. Because, of course, that was their main enemy, and they fought, unlike bourgeois democrats, they fought the social democrats and the communists on the same terrain, not somewhere else, on the street and in the factories. And applying the same methods, the strike, street terror, demonstrations, huge marches, parades, the whole paraphernalia of old social democracy was just taken over. If you look at old newsreels presenting old May Day parades in Red Vienna, you will find, to your dismay, that the marching socialists are in uniform, and are marching in military formations, and applauding rhythmically, and chanting and shouting rhythmically, and thousands of flags. We know this from later newsreels. The whole symbolic of the revolutionary movement has been taken over. Of course, the socialist movement was military-minded. They were revolutionaries, and they presented a counter-power. And the counter-power, as a non-counter-power, that was one of the great tricks of fascism, always. They always appeared as rebellious. They called their takeover revolution. And they were fighting against reaction. In the Horst Wessel-Lied, the main campaign song of the Nationalist Socialist Party, they say that we are fighting Marx and reaction. Yes. And they were, to a certain extent, of course, they were against the feudals and so on and so forth. So it was, 60% of what they said and did was taken over from the far left. But the crucial 40% wasn't. And that was, of course, that capitalism was kept alive without the political power of the bourgeoisie. That has been ended forthwith, and it never really came back to Europe. We have countries in Europe where these societies are indeed led by their states and not by the ruling classes. The ruling classes, of course, they have influence. This is why they're ruling classes. They have a very important influence, but the role of repressive forces Look at France, look at Italy, remember 68, you know, it was just like that. You know, because it wasn't social forces that were opposed. They were the weaponless and the powerless against the armed power of the state, of a state which the non-continental European powers never knew in domestic politics. You know, there were times when there were no army stationed on the territory of Britain. No standing army. It was only in the colonies, but you know, the powers that be didn't consider it necessary to keep an army to keep, you know, the workers down. It wasn't necessary. But that has never happened in Europe. That has never happened in Europe. We had always our kind of armed power that kept the proletariat down. And you see, so the whole of Europe has been subjugated in one way or another to a fascist dictatorship through counter-revolution, preventive counter-revolution as it was called, with good reason. Of course, the main aim, immediate political aim of fascist takeovers was, of course, to prevent social revolution from happening and especially from winning. But also there was a number of conquests, of course, a military conquest of Hitler's Germany. And the intellectual, spiritual, emotional, ideological, and political triumph was no less important than the military one. And there are a number of political principles, if you can call them principles, that remain as a living element, not dominant, but living element in continental Europe. One is that no formal political arrangement and rationally devised scheme can be paramount. It is, you know, that comes from Max Weber. It is political will that, of course, is necessary in order to make bureaucracy and all those, you know, iron cages work. But it is the political will that is paramount in any polity, and that should be always superior to mere administration and mere jurisprudence and so on and so forth. And so that's one. Second is, and that has conquered people's convictions, and they are very much alive in the post-war Central and Eastern Europe and Western Europe too, in many quarters. Second is that violence is legitimate, and that order can be kept only by superior force, because it is supposed that the counter forces, occult or not, visible or not, are always very strong. Hence, political mobilization of the public and the strong armed forces and police forces are necessary. Third is that the state's influence upon the economy is subservient to need. Economic policy depends on what the political leadership and the community represented thereby wants. So what is called economic voluntarism. That's planning or not, nationalizations or not, that are always dependent on needs of politics. And that also there's an element of revolutionism, that the transformation, the willed and violent transformation of society should never stop. It's ongoing. There's no aim. There's no goal. It's permanent. It's permanent revolution. And okay, so why did National Socialism for its huge triumph, racism, more narrowly anti-Semitism. Quite apart from people's convictions who led these movements. Nobody had to teach them anti-Semitism. They were anti-Semites to start with. But why did it become such a central element, after all, anti-Semitism is something that existed before? Why was it a central element, and why ended in such an incomparably tragic way as it did? Of course, I cannot explain it all, also I don't know some of it, but some political elements are quite clear. It is, as has been described by our deceased friend, Moshe Postone, in an important and famous essay, as value fetishism, and value fetishism, explained humbly, and not in his parlance but in mine, means that capitalism being an abstraction, well, not persons rule, but paradigms and algorithms, where growth and degrowth are determined by such forces as technology and by the technology of the economic enterprises themselves, but mostly of such abstract things as value, as money, and so on. All this abstraction needs a body. No rule can be easily imagined except in the form of a social group. And because of the nature of capitalism is occult, it is hidden, it is invisible, then an occult and hidden group has to be presented as the embodiment and the secret ruler of a society in which the main activities of people are not visibly directed by human will. As value is not will, and plus value is neither, and accumulation is neither, and so on and so forth. Now, the Jews were, of course, there, always identified traditionally with usury and money and so on and so forth. So they played a symbolic role. Why weren't they content to stop at using, like, hostile minority groups have been always used in history as scapegoats and so on, it's not new. Why should they also kill the Jews? It wasn't necessary. They played their propagandistic role and political role. They helped to win elections and referenda and such. Why take it seriously? Why take it literally? Why should this metaphor of the body politic and the strange body, or excrescence or something, be taken au pied de la lettre? Why? Well, that's at the bottom of the real innovation of fascism. Because this is, in its completeness, a biopolitical regime that defines good and bad, not good and bad, desirable and undesirable, in terms of earthly felicity expressed in terms of corporeal pleasure and of corporeal integrity and of ideals of physical beauty and physical attractiveness. And, the blonde, blue-eyed Aryan and so on. And, this has been so fundamental to fascism and so different from everything that went on before, since the Enlightenment, and even after. It's unique, and hence deeply not only disturbing but also subversive. And therefore they had to take it seriously. And they had to do, well, of course, it could have happened in some other way too, of course, but some of this had to happen. And also, you know, the killing of the life that is not worth living, that is the cripples and mental patients and homosexuals and so on and so forth, and many ill people anyway. So it was a serious business in which corporeal pleasure and earthly felicity played their role to the hilt. And this is also an old ideal of humankind. And but combined with a thoroughgoing, fundamental transformation of all human communities, it presented humankind with a choice, and that choice has been acted out in the most horrendous way, and also it has shown, you know, as a lesson, it has shown where such politics, based on biopolitics, based on the body, and refusing reason, and rejecting reason, and rejecting the invisible, rejecting the indirect, rejecting the universal, the non-immediate, can lead. Not only fascism. And so, you know, if you take fascism seriously, that's a warning to all of us to mind our political ideas and be very careful about them. Okay, Central Europe. Central Europe has been fashioned by I'm finishing in a moment, by fascism and by the right. In what way? Nobody needed to destroy bourgeois society. The Soviet system didn't really need to annihilate bourgeois society because it was almost destroyed. They didn't need to make people used to radical revolutionary change because people were used to it. It wasn't unheard of to have a tyrannical leadership that interfered intensely with people's private lives, because that was the case before. Some revolutionary energies, described by a totally unknown Hungarian Marxist theorist whose work appeared in Hungary in 1945, and it was banned immediately to the request of the communists, because it quoted Lukács and Karl and others who shouldn't have been quoted. He says, Justus is his name, Paul Justus is his name, he says that he wrote this book in 1942. It's called The Socialist Road, The New Conditions of the Class War. This is what the book is called. And he says that, can we use the revolutionary energies unleashed by the Nazis? And his answer is yes. Strangely enough, it is yes. He says that everything that has been certain, all the convictions of the old regime, have been shaken to the core. We should not try to rebuild it. We should go on from where the fascists left off, and the profound upheaval, the profound subversion of the old regime, the profound change in what people consider to be high and to be low, to be up and to be down, to be black and to be white, that has been successfully undermined by fascists, and this undermining, however, is done by our enemies. It is something that humankind needs. And, well, nothing came of it, because, of course, the Soviet regimes were pretty conservative and went to revolutionary, especially, of course, after 1945 in these countries. And they didn't want any revolution, that's for sure. And they wanted quiet. And they had it. Now, so you see, the old regime has been destroyed on the continent of Europe to a very large extent by fascism. This is unavoidably will leave traces. When people who would advocate change today, people on the left, to use an imprecise term, are not faced with the ancien régime. That's dead. Has been long dead. But, again a lesson to us, exploitation and oppression still flourishes. Because it is not the old style caste inequality that is our problem today. The problem today for us, more than for the Westerners, is capitalism in all its nakedness being bereft of the complex elements of an evolved bourgeois society and also of the traditions of a well-established old ruling establishment. Such things don't exist. Not only here, but not even in Germany, where there are some traces of the old bourgeoisie here and there. You know, especially in the northwest, but not, you know, also in the south in some places, but not so much. That's true everywhere. We are state peoples. And no real powerful social group has emerged to claim total power. It has been always political groups that exercise such power. So these are not the traditional conservative societies against which our Western comrades are still struggling. The authority is still there, to a very large extent. The United States is a country much more conservative than we are. All those habits, all those pieties, all those prejudices, all that respect for the Constitution. Of course, there are lots of hypocrisy in it, but so it is the case of all conservative societies. They are hypocritical. Of course, we are not hypocritical. We are cynical. And that's a great difference. Why are we cynical? We are not any worse than other peoples. It is a consequence of the historical disaster that befell us, where really traditions are extremely weak. Not only the good traditions, but the bad traditions too. All traditions are weak, because the attitude of cherishing and esteeming tradition needs an establishment, needs the habit of deference. We don't have that. Every respected establishment has been chased away in the most humiliating fashion. And there's no respect. You know, anybody who observes the East European and Central European countries knows that the more you go to the East, the less respect you find. This doesn't mean that it's a liberal or anarcho-libertarian attitude. No, people can, of course, obey, but they will never respect. And that's a great difference, you see. It's a question of direct, a question of power put in all its nakedness. And, of course, yes, that's an element for a future revolution, again, if you wish, because all those veils that are enveloping oppression and exploitation in older and richer countries don't exist here. Nobody believes in all those bromides with which exploitation is justified. People might tolerate exploitation and repression, but most certainly won't fool themselves that it's anything else than exactly that. And, well, of course, it's not formulated in any socialist way. On the contrary, it's formulated mostly in a reactionary way and justifying exclusion and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, this continent's past has been destroyed in the 20th century. Not as indeed the socialists had dreamed in the 19th century, but on the contrary, in the opposite way. Nevertheless, the old regime is gone, and we are faced with not much. It's a society, the emotional and cultural elements of which, the cohesive elements of which, are extremely weak. And there have been pretty weak in 1918 too. That's one of the lessons of the revolutions. The revolution succeeded in a few minutes. There's no resistance, no serious resistance. There was terror against it, but no popular resistance. People didn't think that it was inconceivable that all those age-old institutions will disappear in a second. They said, okay, let them go. And so therefore, one of the characteristics of Central Europe and of similar places is that the conflict is again not between conservatives and progressives. The conflict is still between socialists and fascists. Thank you. Yes, you know, there is this Hungarian saying, speaking a hole in somebody's belly, you know, lyukat beszélni a hasába, you know. That's what I did, and I do apologize.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much for your talk. So the question, I'm not really sure about this question, but I'm wondering, on the basis of what you said, could it be the case that, again, truly emancipatory, revolutionary leftist politics has never been really possible? Because it seems that once leftists are faced with the choice that they need to engage in revolution and start killing people and so on and so forth, well, they face precisely the kind of paradoxes that Lukács and others do. And it seems to me that the fascists have a good answer, which is we can kill you, but you can't kill us because that's how things are, and we don't have to explain it. And very clearly, the leftists cannot explain it. They have to acknowledge that this is a paradox, this is a tragedy. We can't consistently go ahead with it and remain loyal to their universalism and so on and so forth. So is it the sort of, is it as tragic as it seems? And what do you think about the potentials of revolutionary politics on the left if this is the case?
Well, yes, of course, I think it's genuinely a tragic dilemma. And in some ways, of course, it's not new. In some other ways, of course, other humanist approaches to human life, you know, such as Stoicism or Christianity, etc., have been sorely tested by such problems, by the problem of earthly power for those ancient philosophies that were more attracted by the care of the soul than of worldly power, but they were faced with the responsibility or the temptation of earthly power, and they had similar. But indeed, you know, but this is not simply, of course, true, that's also the case, not simply the question of goals, ends and means. That's true, obviously. But, so if you are faced with, as a universalist revolutionary, as somebody who wants freedom, and there's nothing more opposite to freedom than violent death. And, you know, Engels, old Engels, who wasn't a fool, not my favorite philosopher, but certainly a very intelligent man, said that there is nothing more authoritarian than revolution. In this sense, of course, because people are killed, and people are forced to do things they don't want to do. Violence, coercion. Yes, this will always be a problem for leftist revolutionaries if there are any, even if very bad violence can be avoided, but this is a detail. The question is, the old Lukácsian question, can you indeed build a non-coercive society with coercive methods, and even building up institutions that exercise coercion systematically? Our historical experience tells us no. But maybe this is not the cause. There are also other causes why, of course, socialist revolutions and socialist states and other attempts of this kind have failed or have been defeated. You can't really say about the Russian Revolution that it failed. It lived on in various shapes and then died after a long time. But certainly it has been defeated by various forces. But the problem itself presents itself to my mind in the following way, as it has indeed been the case before. There are two moral dilemmas. One about how to act properly, and the second, what blame attaches itself to non-action. This has always been, that's a real problem. So, are you refraining from acting badly? Because hurting and confining and killing, of course, is bad. There's no getting away from that, obviously. In order to avoid a greater evil or the outright radical evil. And that was, of course, the problem of Fritz Adler, as I told you, and has been the problem of many people ever since. And I think that it can be answered only by keeping the two in a balance. And that, of course, is a question also of sagacity and of personal choice. There is one, and I'm not a utilitarian, and I don't think that the greater good will trump evil actions. No, I don't think so. What happens to a society against which such acts have been committed? What is the effect, the psychological and the moral effect on societies that have been hurt by violence? And what is, of course, the effect on people who are committing it? And the experience is bad, but also the question is, for the revolutionary himself or herself, is that is any change worth any sacrifice? Moral sacrifice, I mean. That's the question. Can we sacrifice anything dear to us in terms of such moral principles when we want to change something? We do it routinely in everyday life. This is not what I mean. What I mean is that correct? Is that justified? And the question of violence, the original violence, is an extreme case of this problem. And also this is ends and means problem, and also the problem that has been mostly asked by theology, because of course we don't only want to act rightly, but we also want to be good people. That's one of our aims. The aim of moral behavior is these two, I mean, very elementarily. And most certainly somebody who exercises coercion and repression cannot be a good person. So the loss is immense. How can you choose a course of action that is not only moral in respect of others, but also helps you to be a good person? And that's, of course, the old idea of Dostoevsky. Of course, that's the Russian literature idea, but basically it's a Christian idea, because that's where it originates. And that plays also an important role in people's becoming revolutionaries. Because you see, how are revolutionaries born? usually. We do have a great amount of history about this. We know how people had become revolutionaries. Many of them had become revolutionary because of an uneasy conscience, because of a sight of human suffering in the world, exploitation especially, and many people thought that if I don't do anything against it, I'm responsible. I who see clearly, but that was their illusion maybe, or their faith anyway, their belief, if I see clearly that the way of the world is wrong, who am I, said Lukács, after Hebel, who am I to resist this temptation to the good, to combine a quotation from Lukács and a quotation from Brecht. Who am I to? Is it more important for me to be a good person, or to save others, or to do something towards saving others, of course? Isn't that this old Christian idea of the goodness of the soul not egoistic after all? Not commonly egoistic, but And so many people said, okay, I won't want to be myself innocent and good, but I will stake everything on the future and try to create a world in which such dilemmas won't occur. This is how people have become, schematically, revolutionaries. Rejecting their sincere desire, because many of them were extremely good people, their own desire to be good persons. So in other words, not only there is no easy solution to this, but I think there's hardly any rational solution to it, and it will always depend, and this I think that Lukács was quite right, always depend on a people's consequence in following the principles according to which they were prepared to sacrifice their personal goodness. And yes, I don't know whether psychologically this is satisfactory. It seems that it isn't. Nevertheless, this is quite logical. It is a trade. You sacrifice your own personal goodness, not simply for a greater good, but for the good of others, and also for the good of those who can remain good persons, or can become good persons. And I won't, I cannot. So this is how it has been solved, and although I'm not very satisfied with this, because it's very tragic, and who the hell wants to face such tragic choices, I have nothing better to offer.
Shall I speak up?
Yeah, I think the mic was the okay. Go for it.
Thank you. So I would like to ask you what would you put in this matrix of 7 elements the role of nation state and national identity. So in 100 years ago, in Central Europe there was a multinational structure which collapsed, and the fight between socialist and fascist, as you framed it at the end and throughout, is so the so-called fascist side is certainly using conceptualization of nation states and national identity to get support.
Okay.
Would you agree that for the other side, it's sort of necessary to compete with those fascist,
Okay.
we call it that way, conceptualizations of national identity, or that's a dead end road?
That's not quite true, The Nazis were not nationalists, and they didn't strive to establish a nation state. They used nationalism, they used many other things that have been already in existence. They were racists. You can't be a nationalist and a racist. The two things, or in my terms in that study called ethnicism, ethnicism and nationalism are opposed. Nationalism, indeed, based on the idea of a nation state, which means an equal citizenship for all citizens within a nation state. It is an old political concept. It's based on citizenship, on legal obedience, on national institutions to which you owe obedience, and a good order that you defend, and of course also colored by national culture and ethnic traditions and languages and so on and so forth. But the Third Reich was on the one hand was racist. For example, they had plans to obliterate the non-Germanic and non-Scandinavian, not Nordic elements of the German population for after the war. Just remained in a plan, thank God. And also there was no clear aim at the conquest. They wanted a European empire. Did they want to exterminate everybody? Hardly. But it wasn't clear that they wanted a nation state. They wanted a huge empire where indeed the Aryans, the Germans and the Scandinavians, they wanted, for example, Himmler had plans to force intermarriages between Scandinavians and Germans to improve the racial stock of the German nation, soiled by Latins and God knows who, and Celts. And so you can hardly call this preference for the nation state. So that's not quite true. So, and obviously, many nationalists have been inspired to become fascists, and there's underlapping, obviously the underlapping areas between nationalism and fascism and National Socialism, but by no means identical. So therefore, the idea of a supranational empire, certainly not a federation in the Enlightenment sense, of Kantian sense of the word, certainly, that of course is irreconcilable with the Third Reich. But who were the examples they have invoked? It was Frederick II, the Germanic emperor who had his realm in Sicily and who conquered the Near East. Of course, with the supremacy of the Germanic element, that was, of course, their supposition. So I don't think that there are parallels to contemporary and also very old oppositions between nation states and supranational bodies and so on, Europe in our case nowadays. And it was true that there were movements towards national independence in the 19th century, obviously. There was a time when the nationalism was on the left. In 1848, of course, national liberations and national independence were emancipatory, liberatory aims that coincided with democratism and such. Well, this is not any longer the case, but that doesn't concern us, only as citizens, but not tonight, maybe. Also, I'm asking myself to what, and here I'm coming closer, maybe not to your sentences, but your thought behind them, if I'm not wrong. Is it true that what we experience today as an antipathy towards supranational institutions is truly nationalism? I'm not quite certain. Some of it necessarily. But where does this resistance against the supranational institutions appear? Let me just mention a few very important ones. First, of course, the migration. Obviously, international institutions, supranational institutions, are seen as being the willing or duped agents of illegal migration, it is called in some circles. That's one thing that is very important. Second is, of course, the environment. The environment. So again, supranational institutions that are supposed to want to change our natural way of life. Okay? With mongrelization, as the sincere Hungarian far-right press will put it, mongrelization, the unholy change and mixture of various races, and also, stopping us from driving cars and heating our houses and eating meat and all that kind of thing. So all this reforming our ways that seem to us naturally, changing the biopolitical aspects of our social life. This is what elicits the greatest resistance on the right today, greatest emotional and political resistance. These two, but there are others, of course, but these two are the, and these things have nothing to do with nationalism. Racism is not nationalism, and we know perfectly patriotic, especially Western people who have no opposition to various minority ethnic groups participating, and so on. And there have been such patriots even before. That's not a new thing, but not all patriots are, of course, opposed to opposition groups and so on and so forth. And so, these resistances are of the fascist type, but they are not complete. What are they lacking? Well, the revolutionary element. Exactly that revolutionary subversive element that makes fascism, that makes fascism different from other kinds of being reactionary or racist or exclusionary or, friend of hierarchy and friend of repression. Yes.
My question would be a bit practical concerning value or production. Because the picture you have painted is quite impressive. I want some glimpse of light. So that would the aim of a new revolutionary movement, and I'm not saying that only by doing this would be enough. So would the aim of a new revolutionary movement be primarily to change the mode and way of production? Could that be an agent of change by itself, changing the way of production in this new society?
Well, if somebody ever tried, really and truly, that would be. So I think that ignoring for a moment the preconditions of such an action, such a huge collective action as to change the mode of production, which would be, of course, the aim of a socialist revolution. Let's neglect this, but let's suppose that is indeed changing. That will, of course, mean a very profound moral change too, obviously. So that, if put it simply, if alienation ceases, if people acting from reasons and motivations that have nothing to do with them, if they cease acting from them, if indeed human unity is pieced again together, where there's no real separation, the old dream, but still it's the result of the changing of the mode of production, where indeed means and ends meet, and where the difference between physical work and intellectual work ceases to be, and creativity will, of course, become freer, and so on and so forth. Obviously, it will mean a huge moral change. Therefore, if such a moral change is imaginable, then, of course, there's a very strong reason to act in that direction. We have been quite timid in using moral argumentation in favor, not everybody, of course, but in favor of a socialist transformation. And even in this room, I know people who have been trying to do that. But on the whole, the left, as it is, has been wary, for various reasons, easy to see why. But it is quite true that this is not a technical change, it's not a change in redistribution only, of course. This is not a creation just simply of a fairer and juster society. It is the profound change in the human way of life, you see. And where, the re-merger, the reunification of the human self can be attempted. God knows how that's really possible. Nevertheless, it can be attempted. It could certainly have a chance. Where, things that have been separated. Of course, capitalism is a system of various separations. Yeah. When will and reason are closer, when inner motivation, as something that was used to be called the soul, is closer to the collective activity, to human intercourse, that means, of course, a profound change in communication, as it is called, and so on and so forth. So in that respect, well, why I am myself a leftist? Of course, because I believe in that. That just simply saying that capitalist society is bad because it's self-defeating in respect and anarchic and given to crisis and not protecting humankind from unhappiness and tragedy and wars and catastrophes and so on and so forth. But that, in principle, could be solved. You could imagine that an enlightened world government with a great dictatorship, could prevent, global warming and the thermal catastrophe in humankind. It could, in principle. But do I want tyrannical world government more than global warming? Not much. Hence such goals as keeping humankind alive and reasonably well provided for can be combined with desirable or at least promising moral aims being logically imaginable to be the possible results of a change in the way of things, then it should be attempted, I think. So I'm not giving up. The chances are abysmal, but that's not for us to decide. This is about choosing a way of thinking about things and choosing, well, a choice that should be, of course, supported by argument and supported by reflection, obviously. Choosing also a way of life and behavior. And you can recognize, of course, leftists, the best kind at least, by their interest in reality. And their antipathy to myth. Because they want a very profound change that cannot be only based on belief. Okay, so this is why people, on the left go, especially Marxists, could go on having philosophical and sociological and economic and etc. debates about what is what and what could be done maybe, and also what can really be desirable. And I just read recently an article, a leftish article, that simply advocated collectivism. Okay, I can understand that, but are we against individualism? Are we against the flourishing of individuality? The hell, we are of course not. A collectivist opposition to bourgeois individualism and to the loneliness which it expresses, the difficulty of communication, the difficulty of togetherness, and the difficulty of mutual understanding and comprehension of people. Of course, that's a tragedy, but that cannot be replaced by a blind faith in the virtue of togetherness and of collective action of whatever nature. No, that whatever nature bothers me, because emancipatory collective action is one thing, but there are of course others. So This is my tentative and hesitant answer to the question.
Maybe we have time for one more.
And then there's wine, so please, don't forget. I also brought, not only this. Also the department has donated some wine. I don't know where it is, but... Okay. Oh, hello. Right. One more question. Well, yes. Yes. Quite true.
My question would be about the binarity that you are very keen on in this, not only in socialism and fascism, but also in other works of yours. Do you not find this as something that could be an obstacle in actually applying either better kind of world, see world in these binarities and binarities only?
No. Of course not. This is, of course, an exaggeration, an abstraction. And also, I'm not at all a dogmatic and a fanatic. I don't think that it would not be useful, since we live in a complex society, to have honest liberals and honest non-socialist Democrats and etc., who would have their say and who would be a valuable part of an alliance against reaction and the extreme right. Obviously. Simply, I do not believe that bourgeois society can be indeed renewed on bourgeois terms. I don't think that liberalism, that has its noble traditions, and I don't despise it as it is fashionable. Yes, I don't like that fashion at all. It's an infection of the left from the right, but unfortunately or fortunately, this is not a great possibility. I think the moment is past. In which such halfway houses can offer solutions. I'm not so happy about this radical and, if you wish, very threatening dilemma. And also, of course, it's a simplification. Obviously, post-fascism, you may know my essay is not fascism, but I express myself, in a summary fashion and a schematic fashion. But I hope that you won't misunderstand me. I don't think that we are facing Hitlers now, because we don't. We aren't. And okay, so yes, I think that a better world, even on more modest terms than a completely free and emancipated and unrepressed and disalienated and de-reified system, which would be beautiful, that I wouldn't be content with something that is not as perfect, but it's much better than the world of today. Of course I would, but I doubt it. Unfortunately, that is possible. I mean, look at contemporary politics. It seems that the most stable liberal democratic systems are collapsing or are severely wounded. And, Bolsonaro, how is that possible? He was elected after all. Elections are still being considered for some reason incomprehensible to me, because they lost their relevance long ago. Anyway, he was elected in Brazil by a great popular majority without any major electoral fraud, and the man promises assassinations. So even if he in the end won't be able to assassinate as many people as he wishes, but that was his electoral platform, and not even Hitler dared to say such a thing when he was elected with a plurality, not a majority. He became federal chancellor of the German Reich. Well, he promised what all elected politicians promise, more order, more riches, more national glory, everything will be hunky-dory and so on. But, to say that fellow citizens, I will kill as many of your number as I wish. I mean, so that means that, that morally the whole thing is so undermined, as indeed it has been undermined before. Still, why is it not so violent as in the 20s and the 30s? It's very simple. Because we don't have organized working class and strong socialism. This is why. They don't need to. And if we had militant, revolutionary and determined socialist forces in Europe, you know perfectly well how will they act. Of course, as they have always acted. And so it is the weakness of the left, the weakness of countervailing powers, that is the only secret, or the main secret of the quiescent, more or less quiescent nature of these societies that undergo great changes from above, tolerating it pretty well, not always so well, but on the whole pretty well. And you see, this is why the best minds of the extreme right today can pinpoint the smallest Marxist group anywhere and present it as a major danger. Oh, I wish that it were a major danger. Of course it isn't, but Steve Bannon knows all of you. And, right, so, he's a cultural Marxist. Cultural Marxist, I know what it means and where it comes from. Actually, it comes from Joseph Goebbels' Kulturbolschewismus. But anyway, but it means mostly, practically, that we are all intellectuals and that the working class is not socialist any longer, which is, of course, the greatest single political problem for any left, obviously. And so yes, I would go and be gradualist and reformist if there would be any chance. So that's a political thing. So this is why I'm stressing these extreme dilemmas, even metaphorically exaggerating and so on and so forth, because that seems to be the case. But of course, the balance of forces is different. Thank you. Okay, let's get tipsy. Okay.